Okay, so now what we're going to do is cover some of the components that we haven't seen in the insole we just made. They're maybe a little bit less common, shall we say. First we'll go with is a whale. So called, but it looks like a whale with its tail sticking up. More extreme versions look more like whales. What this is essentially the same as a D-fill. It's a D-fill with it's an extended D-fill that comes slightly around the back of the heel. So slightly around the back of the heel. So what that does is just gives a bit more support to the inside of the heel. It acts as a medial stabilizer. So we've seen the lateral stabilizer, that's just a medial stabilizer. To make it, as we'll see later, is very much the same as a D-fill. It's just extended, so it makes that a little bit more tricky. Then we have a shaft. Now that can be almost anywhere. It gives extra offloading to a bone or a bone spur or anything else. Now what this can do, you can have this on top if it's a nice low soft one, or what you can do, especially if it's quite a thick one, we have it underneath. So what that then does, it smooths out the extra support. If you have quite a thick, thin one, it's quite extreme to put that underneath the foot, so it could be quite uncomfortable. So we put it underneath. But also for offloading, we have a PMP with a cutout. And as we see later, this is slightly different in that we do most of the grinding on the top side, but we actually grind underneath the cutout bit. But that's for smoothness. So when it's glued down, that touches the base and it's a nice and smooth. Because we're trying to offload that area, we don't want to create any sharp edge that might then create discomfort. And with the shaft, what we can do with the shaft is actually put that underneath as well. So that then super offloads, and put it underneath underneath the PMP, it gives a nice smooth, higher offload. Another fairly common thing we do is a preformed wedge. You can see this has been machined. We'll show you how to do that later. These generally go underneath because they're very hard. They generally go underneath. It's just to correct the angle of the foot. So that's one of the few things that's glued underneath. And lastly, we have the more extreme version of the D-fill, which is called a cobra. As you can see, it's a kind of hissy cobra. It's essentially a D-fill and a whale and a lateral stabilizer with joined together around the back of the heel. And as we'll see later, this is quite tricky to manufacture. We don't do them very often. But what we end up with is your standard D-fill with the profile, but then we have it all the way around the back. This is quite often to relieve that area underneath the heel. Here we are, we're now doing a whale. It's basically the same as the D-fill with a bit extra. So first thing we do, put the outside edge on, clean it up, and then we work on doing the inside edge. The front end of the whale is exactly the same as doing it for a D-fill. In fact, it is exactly the same as a D-fill. So work around holding it firmly on one end and putting your hand underneath to get all the pressure up onto the grinder. Now when you turn it around, you can see it's got an inside curve and an outside curve. So it's basically the same as doing a D-fill, but you have to make sure you move it around the curve, because if you do it in like a D-fill, you may well take the whale part off. So you have to follow the curve all the way around, maneuvering your D-fill. Now we do the front end, get the profile on the front end. Again, exactly the same as a D-fill. The only difference is the back end. Whales tend also to be a bit larger, so you end up with a much longer profile. But in this case, it's basically the same. So again, supporting underneath. In this case, I'm just using one finger to support it because I'm not putting that much pressure through. You can do it. You can use the flat of a hand as well. It just makes it more stable. So again, putting the basic bevel on. That's nice, nearly there. Okay, then we go to the back end. It's exactly the same thing. It goes from a sharp point all the way to up to the high point in a single bevel, but because it goes around a corner, it can be more difficult to see. As you can see from the right hand view, it going round the corner, it makes it seem longer and more difficult because you can't really see the whole bevel in one go. But as long as you're careful, take your time, don't put too much pressure through it, it will come out nice and smooth, just like a normal defill. It's nearly there. Just clean that top bit off. And now we're doing a shaft and a PMP with a cutout. So here we start with the shaft. As with any component, you have to start off with a sharp edge all the way around. Although because a shaft is quite small and generally thin, it's much trickier. So you have to be much more careful you don't grind your thumbs down. But you can move it around nicely. You don't have to do all of it in one go. Because this is only the first pass, take your time, just make sure you get a nice sharp edge on. This is more important obviously if it's going on top of the base rather than underneath, but you still need to make it as clean as possible to make it as comfortable as possible. Doing the edges is a little bit more difficult. Just have to make sure you keep your thumbs out of the way and be very careful. Take your time. In everything, take your time. So now we've got an edge. We've now got the sharp edges. We just need to try and make the profile. So this is a case of I'm just using the flex of the material as the pressure on the grinder. So again, it's polishing the corner off and making it nice and round, or as round as you can. That's looking all right. All the way around, so it's the same width. Right, you want a nice consistent pressure when the foot's on it. Now the PMP, again, apart from the cutout, is exactly the same as a normal PMP which we've seen already. First things first, run the edge along the grinder just to put the sharp edge on. This is the 6mm one, so there's quite a lot of meat to take off, but it's pour on, so it's very soft. And as I said before, the cutout is machined on the underside, so we just have to move it out of the way and carry on putting the sharp edge all the way around the outside. Front end, we need to put a little profile on there just for comfort. It's the same process as putting the sharp edge around the outside. You put the sharp point on the front end of the PMP. Yeah, it's nice. And again, you created a sharp edge, so you need to polish it off. Because it's a 6mm component, that it's much more critical that you get rid of that sharp edge, because it's so much higher that it will be so much more easy to feel through a cover if there is a sharp edge on it. So you have to make sure it's nicely rounded and smooth with no sharp edge. That's okay. Now we turn it over. Now because you want to do the inside, you flex it so you can see those edges are 90 degrees to each other, and you just move them through, and that pretty much does it in one pass. Just maybe a little bit tidying up if there's a slightly sharp edge. Here's a wedge. Now, as we said before, it's a lot harder material, so it really needs to be smooth. And because you've got the preformed wedge doesn't have a sharp edge itself, you always have to put a sharp edge on the inside edge. It's normally about 1 millimeter thick, so it's not too much material to take off. And now, because the edges also are very sharp, and as you can see they're quite deep, you need to put a sharp edge all the way down there, and also put a nice profile on, so that when the foot's on top of it, you can't feel the edge. It should be a nice ramp, so they will feel the block underneath their foot, but it won't feel too uncomfortable. Here we go, turn it round to the other side. Again, it's a very hard material, so you do have to put a little bit more pressure on it. However, because the grinder is very efficient, you don't need to put so much pressure on, you take it all off in one go. So again, keep moving it, take a little bit off, check it, take a little bit off. So I didn't quite have the profile right there. Then polishing the sharp edge off, just hardly any pressure on it. Make sure it's nice and even. Now here we're going to do a cobra. As you can see, it's slightly different in that the defill section stops short of the end, and you've got the tail going around it. First thing first, as always, put the edge, clean the outside edge up, and then put the nose bevel on. This is exactly the same as for a defill. The only difference being you have to keep the tail out of the way, because otherwise it can catch and then tear. The grinder is very, very good at catching components and either ripping them out of your hands or tearing the component itself. Especially when it's pour on, it's quite soft. To put the nose profile on, again, same as for a defill. I mean, it is a defill, so it's exactly the same process. All the difference is down the back end which we'll get to in a moment. You can see, just put the profile on, work it nice and carefully, gently, don't push it onto the machine, don't push it into the machine, have it slight pressure up onto the machine. There you go, that's the profile done. Now this back end, what we want to do is profile the PPT part only. So we flex it out the way, flex the poron out of the way, and use the very edge of the grinder just to go very carefully, just to go around the edge of the PPT without digging into the poron. And there we have that. So then we just keep the tail out the way, just very carefully starting on the edge of the PPT, just profiling that section of the defill. And we can very carefully, holding the tail out the way, just carry on with the inside bevel all the way around the bit of the defill. This is the easy bit. As you can see, the tail is quite problematic, and it makes it quite tricky to machine. But the next thing we do is the lateral stabilizer section. So as always, you put a nose profile on it for comfort, so you don't have a sharp edge on any part of the component. And then we can work on beveling the inside. So again, you keep now to flex the defill out of the way, and minding your fingers, just very carefully, more carefully than you would do for a lateral stabilizer, because it's that much more difficult to do. Just make sure you get your nice lateral stabilizer profile, which is basically taking half the material off, turning a square section into a triangle. And now we're trying to start work on the inside of the heel curve. Again, much like the cutout on the PMP, you flex it, and in this case, because it's so wide and floppy, you can't really do it in one procedure. So you have to, little bit at a time, keep making sure your fingers are out of the way. This may seem like you can end up with a bit of a mix and match, cut and paste job, but it's the only way you can really do it. So here we're flexing it. So again, you've got one nice curve to work with. You're just trying to get the same bevel and a nice same sharp edge all the way around the back of the heel. As you can imagine, a lot of force goes through the heel when someone's walking. So you really need to make sure that's nice and smooth and haven't got a lump on the inside, and it's a nice sharp edge going down to 0 all the way around. See, it's not quite there. There's about 1 millimeter of material still to go. And this is where it gets very tricky. You have to be very careful here. It's very easy to overwork this component at this point and end up with something that won't do any good. It's just finishing off the bevel on the inside there towards the tail end of the defill. Again, you can see, like we have with the PMP, there's a bit of fraying on the inside. Again, that just means that you've gone down to 0. That's fine, that'll ping off, and they won't feel it when it's on the component. So there we go, it looks just about almost there. It looks a bit weird, but that will function quite nicely.